Hey, Bible nerds, this is Dr. Manny Arango. Welcome to the Bible Department podcast powered by Arma. We are walking through the entire Bible in a year. You can go to the description or thebibledepartment.com to download a reading plan and join the journey. We are back. I am incredibly proud of you. We're going to finish up 1 Peter today. All right, we're going to finish up 1 Peter. If you have not done the reading, then just go ahead, pause this, mute me. I'll be right here when you're done with the reading. Go ahead, do the reading. We've got to read 1 Peter chapter 4 and 1 Peter chapter 5. Two short chapters, and I'm going to give us just enough information so that the reading will make sense and you can get a lot out of it. All right, let's do it. Context clue, okay? Remember, okay, when Jesus gets arrested, Peter is the guy who has a sword on him. Let's just pause right there. I mean, my man traveled with a sword. So I want you to think about how changed, how transformed Peter's worldview is, because he's writing an entire book to persecuted Christians, telling them, hey, don't repay evil for evil. Hey, don't, I know the Roman world that you have been called to minister to is persecuting you. I don't want you to have that same spirit back. I don't want you to have that same heart back. I want you to be like Jesus. So chapter 4 starts out with these exact words. Since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh. Okay, so everything that I'm about to tell you is because Jesus suffered in the flesh. I want you to follow in his footsteps. I want you to actually be like him. I think this is hard for anyone to hear who's not lived in any kind of persecution, who's not lived in a country or in a nation or under a government regime where Christians are being persecuted. I want you to try to put yourself in a context where the Roman governor, I mean, you're not in Rome. These are Christians who are getting this from Peter, who's in Rome, but they are in Asia Minor. So they're under Nero, the Caesar, but they're under local governors who have the green light to completely kill, torture, not just social persecution. We're talking physical and literal persecution. Put yourself in that frame of mind. And Peter's giving this appeal to like suffer well. And part of Peter's testimony is that he got this really, really wrong. Like right before Jesus is arrested, he pulls out a sword and he goes and he cuts off the high priest's servant's ear. Like Peter is someone who is down to fight back. And I can relate to Peter. I am not the lay down and just act like everything's okay. I'm not like a people pleaser or like that's not my personality. I'm feisty and I'm a fighter. And I can see Peter over the course of his life changing and transforming into the kind of person that's been marked by the person of Jesus. And you can just see it. It's a night and day difference. Peter, who I don't even why did this man even have a sword? Clearly Jesus knew he had a sword and just didn't bother him about it. I want you to see this. This is chapter 5. It says, so I exhort the elders among you as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ. So like the sufferings of Christ, it's front and center. And from that little detail, we realize, yeah, Peter's in his older years at this point in his life. This is probably, Peter's probably in his 50s or 60s. Like this man has had decades to ponder on what it means to have seen Christ arrested and to witness the sufferings of Jesus. All right, so that's kind of like just some context. That's our context clue. Let's move into a nerdy nugget for the day. This is little thing, and if you know it, then it immediately clicks that the persecution that these Christians are facing is because Nero has burned the city of Rome down. Okay. And he has now blamed it on the Christians. And he's using Christians as a scapegoat in the fabric of the Roman society. And so there's these two little, just like Peter is brilliant in terms of the subtlety of his writing. And you can see his nod to that fire in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 12 and 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 7. I'll read 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 7 first. Remember, Christians are probably living in the worst conditions that they've lived in the Roman government because of Nero's decisions. And here's how Peter is going to frame this. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 7 says this: so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire. You can see like the use of the word fire, very, very intentional. Then we're going to get it one more time. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 12. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. First of all, we can just break down that whole verse, but the fiery trial. Don't be surprised at the fiery trial. I think Peter is saying, yeah, suffering's always a testing by fire. Suffering's always a fiery trial. But I think he's also saying it specifically based on the context that we know, that Nero has burned Rome down, a fire that's lasted for 5 whole days. And here you have Peter like using the word fire to make everyone remember that the literal fire that they are in and the persecution that is sparked by a literal fire is actually there. And there's 2 things that we need to learn. A, it's going to test you. So like gold, you're going to come out of this more refined and better. And then number 2, you shouldn't be surprised. Like, why are you even shocked? We serve a Messiah. We serve a God. We serve a God made flesh that suffered. So why should we be shocked that we're suffering? And I'll get into that a little later in my timeless truth. Okay, let's like kind of move into our nerdy nugget. Before we get into that, I want to give you 2 verses so that you can kind of see Peter's, again, like his theology of suffering is coming out more and more. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 16, and 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 14. I'll read 3:14 first. 3:14. But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. So Peter is saying, hey, whoa, you're suffering for righteousness' sake. You're suffering for a good thing, and you'll be blessed. It's okay. One chapter later, 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 16 to 19 says this: yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. For it is time for judgment to begin with the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? Therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. So again, we just get more of Peter's theology of suffering. All right, last thing that I want to draw our attention to is Peter is going to use this metaphor throughout this epistle. And one of the things that Peter's going to say is that you as an individual are living stones. Okay. And you're being built up into the house of God. Now, this is Peter talking about the temple. He's talking about a house, but really he's talking about the temple because house is a metaphor for Solomon's temple, or the temple that exists up until 70 AD, or that exists in the Old Testament. And so the image that I need you to see is that this entire house, which is a collective unit, is comprised of individual stones. So you are a living stone, but when you come together with all the other believers, you create this thing called the house of God. And so Peter is clear. It's more important that we as a collective unit decide that this is how we are going to respond to the suffering and to the persecution that is currently at hand, and that how we respond and how we decide to respond is more important than how you as an individual want to respond or desire to respond. You can see right here where like our individualistic American Western minds have a problem with, or kind of are at odds with, a group oriented thought process. And Peter gives a clear metaphor that says, yep, you're just one stone that's making up this house. And we want to make sure that we, although we're being persecuted because we're part of a group, and we want to respond to that persecution in a certain way. So you don't need to do what you would do as an individual. We are responding to this as a unit, and we are responding to persecution as a united front. And I think that this metaphor is at the forefront of Peter's mind because he wants the believers to know how you feel as an individual is not more important than how we have decided to respond. And we have decided to obey the government. And we have decided to witness to the wider world in a certain way. It's funny. I was in the Seattle, Washington area. I was talking to a pastor recently, and he said that, he was in a group chat with probably 12 to 15 other pastors. And this is during 2020. And every time the governor of Washington would come out with, churches can be open or can't be open or this or that, he said, of course, like, we gave everybody in the group chat the freedom to respond however they need it to. Obviously, every church needs to respond differently, but said there was this conviction that, like, we all wanted to reopen on the same Sunday, that we wanted to communicate a unified presence in our city. And he said, there's some churches that couldn't rock with that and went ahead and opened before everyone else. And then there's some churches who waited even longer to open. But just that idea that I don't just represent my own interest, I don't just represent my church, but I represent Christians everywhere. And the way that I respond to suffering and hardship and trial and persecution, the way that I respond to that has an impact on how the world thinks about Christians at large. I think that we're in a day and age where we need to get back to that. I know growing up as an ethnic minorities have this group identity, right? Sometimes part of the conflict that happens, especially as Black Americans and white Americans talk about race in America, is that Black people, generally speaking, I'm making generalizations, okay? I'm not talking about every single Black person on the planet, but generally speaking, Black people in America, it's like you grow up knowing I represent Black people. So if somebody does something, if that Black person is doing something that's making us look bad, there's this representation that happens, right? You can even see that in, I grew up in a church where the average person probably couldn't afford to drive a Mercedes. But I remember the year that we all pooled our money together so that our pastor could get a Mercedes, because the pastor becomes the representative of the group. Okay. One of the things that is working against us as we talk about race is that white Americans don't have that same, like, oh, this white person represents our whole group. Like, so when a Black person sees a Black person murdered or, unjustly by the police, I see myself. And when I see a Black person doing something that's embarrassing, I see myself. And Black people tend to think about the group, right? I'm going through life with more of a group centered identity. Whereas in the conversation around race, if you have one group that's like, oh yeah, like our group is taking responsibility for, the actions of one, right? And then it's talking to a group that is steeped in hyper individualism. And so the average white person doesn't see that the actions of one white person represents all white people, right? That's just until it's almost like the conversation underneath the conversation, the question behind the question. Until we can even come to grips with that, it's going to be hard to talk about stressful things as it relates to race. We kind of first have to go, oh, okay, I come into conversations with an assumption, not saying it's right or wrong, but it's a group-oriented assumption. You come into conversation with an individualistic assumption. Okay, great. We're going to have grace for each other so that we can actually see what the other person sees if we're going to have helpful dialogue around race in this country. That's such an aside, but I hope that's helpful, especially if you're in a diverse or multi-ethnic or multicultural context. I hope that's actually really, really helpful. So Peter is saying, well, if you're a Christian anywhere, you represent Christians everywhere. Christians represent Christians. And there are times where I'm like, yeah, that's awesome. And then there are times where I know that pastors don't always represent this group called the clergy well. And sometimes I'm embarrassed to say I'm a pastor because of trifling, just despicable things that pastors have done. I can't address that by denying the reality that the moment somebody engages a pastor, their engagement with me is triggering however many interactions they've had with however many pastors. Peter is saying, hey, the way we interact with the world has to be the way that we do it. And I think that's helpful. And Peter is saying this in the middle of a very, very individualistic Greco-Roman world. What if I told you that what you're learning in this video was just the tip of the iceberg? The Bible department is actually powered by Arma. What is Arma? I'm so glad you asked. Arma is an online subscription-based platform that we designed to help people, everyday people, learn the Bible for themselves. We started Arma so that anybody, anywhere, could have access to trustworthy and entertaining Bible and theology content. In addition to this podcast, we have over 60 courses on individual books of the Bible, on theology topics, and on some hot topics like homosexuality, tithing, and women in ministry. But really, Arma is a community of people that I've gotten to know, a community where thousands of people are currently finding family, asking questions, and nerding out on the Bible together. If you want a community to read the Bible with you this year, or if you want to dive into some deeper theological content, or if you want more exclusive access to me and the entire Arma team, how about you go to thebibledepartment.com. I'll be sure to post the link in the description of this video. Let's make this your year to become a Bible nerd. Let me get to my timeless truth. The way that I suffer, it says something about who I am. Here's what it says in chapter 4, or even 5:1. So I exhort the elders among you as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed. That glory comes after suffering. So I'll frame it this way. Everybody's going to suffer, right? But I can either see this life as the life where I want to hoard all the pleasure I can get and experience all the pleasure I can get and then suffer for eternity separated from God, or I can have a glory to be revealed perspective about life, which is this life is but a blink. Do I want persecution? Do I want suffering? No, but I'd rather suffer on this side of eternity so that I can enjoy eternity with God than suffer for eternity because I saw this life as something to only be enjoyed. And that perspective is a timeless truth that I may not be walking in persecution, but I should be walking as someone who's experiencing some type of suffering. Because here's what 1 Peter chapter 4 says, since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking, for whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. So Peter seems to see that there's some link between physical suffering and an ability for that fire to actually burn up sinful habits within us. And so I want to reframe my life to say, man, if I suffer now, I'll enjoy forever. But if I focus all my attention on enjoying now, I may suffer forever. And that is our timeless truth. All right. Let's get to 2 Peter. I'll see you right here. Love you. Peace. Thanks so much for joining us on the Bible Department podcast. If this episode was helpful, how about you leave a comment, share with a friend, and subscribe so that you never miss an episode. To learn more about the show, head to thebibledepartment.com. We'll see you right back here tomorrow.